Today is September 26th, 2011. I'm here with Shirley R. Johnson at her home in Oberlin, Ohio. The time is 10:30 a.m. Shirley R. was a co-founder of the Yellow Springs and North Central, formerly Oberlin chapter of the ACLU, and a co-founder of the state Ohio ACLU chapter. She has served for many, many years for civil liberties in Ohio. Your interviewer today is Colleen Benoit, History Associate with the ACLU of Ohio. Shirley, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
So Shirley, where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois on July 15th, 1917.
And I understand you spent a portion of your childhood in Flushing. When did you move there?
I moved to Flushing when I was 9 years old to join my father and stepmother. My mother died when I was in 1918 when I was 14 months old, and my father and I moved in with my mother's mother, my grandmother, as did the wife of her son who died of the 1918 flu with her baby. So I was raised by my grandmother for the most, and grandfather, he was my step-grandfather, for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. My father, of course, came home from work every day. And I understand I was the light of everybody's life. And that changed after my father remarried when I was about 5 years old.
So what did your father do for a living?
My father was a lawyer. He was a promising young lawyer. He was the first in his family, a large family, to go to college. And he went to Northwestern Law School and was an outstanding law student, as I understand it. And I don't remember the name of the firm that he was in. I probably have it on some papers that are put away. I know he worked for the North Central Railroad at one time, and he was wooed away from them by Westinghouse Electric and moved there. Let's see, 9 plus 17 is 20, probably in 1924, 25 probably. And he and his wife, my stepmother, were there a year while she had a baby. And then after that, when the baby was about 9 months old, I was asked to go and move in with them. I had lived with, when we were still in Chicago, I had a kind of a checkered career of sometimes living with them during the week and going to school and then going to my grandmother on the weekend and vice versa.
You did attend college in Ohio. Where did you go exactly, and what degree did you earn?
I went to Antioch College, and I graduated from Flushing High School when I was 17, but I was 18 that summer, and I didn't know where I was going to college. In those days, you didn't have anybody much to help you like as you do nowadays when you're in high school. And only 2 colleges I knew about that time were Northwestern and Skidmore, and I wasn't too thrilled about them. I happened to visit a friend that was in high school with me, Jenny Hober, and she said, we were talking about college. She was going to go away to Antioch, and she said, why don't you go to Antioch? And I said, well, that sounds like a religious school. I don't want to go to any religious school. And no, she said, and she told me about it, and I thought that sounded great. And I applied. I was kind of a late applier, and I did apply, and I was fortunately admitted. My name it was kind of interesting. It's an interesting story, which I found out later. In those times, the colleges, particularly, even Antioch, had a quota about Jews. My name was Reinwald, Reinwald, which was often taken to be a Jewish name, and it is not. And I used to hate it in high school when I was asked if I was Jewish. I've always felt if I said, no, I'm not Jewish, people would think I was denying it, and I didn't want to be that kind of a person, but the correct answer was different. I'd run into anti-Semitism when I moved from Chicago to New York. My grandparents drove me, and we had to stop. In those days, it was only tourist homes. And I was very startled to find out when I got east the signs that said Christians only. And people don't remember that, but it was true, and it was particularly true in New York, in the New York area. So that was.
Do you think that kind of experience led you to be interested in civil liberties later?
Well, I just think I was a natural born civil libertarian and a natural born teacher too. And sometimes I laugh. I guess it's all right to say this now because my only relatives that would be interested are not around. But I think I probably became a civil libertarian because my stepmother was not nice to me, and she treated me what I thought unfairly and unkindly, and so I was bound and determined that fairness and how you treat people and how were very important. I always thought nobody would marry me, and I'd probably get married and be somebody's stepmother, and I was going to show everybody what a good stepmother I would be. Fortunately, well, I mean, not fortunately, it wouldn't have mattered if I'd been a stepmother, but.
So taken in tandem, these experiences, and then you had your liberal arts education, how do you think that those...
I think I was a civil libertarian before I went to Antioch College. At Antioch College, I was which was liberal compared to others. They had women's rules, however, which probably grew out of separation of men and women so that men didn't run women. Women had their own rules. But I remember our third year of college, another person and I, her name was Gretchen Robertson, and she married a man named Chuck Weitz eventually. We thought we should be part of community government and have the same kind of government that men did. And we were active in getting rid of women's rules. We got on the board and we got on the committee or whatever it was, and we did that. And when I was a senior in college, no, not of women's rules. I should back up. We were an abolisher of women's government as a separate government. And then when I was a senior, I was co-chair with a fellow named Earl Carnes, and we were the committee to evaluate and study women's rules, and wrote a report which changed them considerably. And when the faculty saw it, they said, more or less, the hell with it, let's just abolish the whole thing. And that's what happened.
That's fantastic. How neat.
And I think I've always raised questions that might be considered civil libertarian. I couldn't do it for myself. I didn't defend myself, but I could always speak up for other people. And that's what I did.
So when did you initially become a member of the ACLU?
Well, I don't know. I have a feeling that I probably joined while I was at Antioch in the 30s. I graduated in 1940. And certainly I was a member in the 50s. And they don't have me, I always mean to write and tell them, they have me a member from 1970. Well, I couldn't have been on the original boards and all those things in the 50s if I wasn't a member earlier than 70. So I know I've been a member at least since 1950 and maybe a little earlier.
Do you recall any specific event that compelled you to join? Certainly that was a turbulent time in the late 40s.
Well, I think everything in general. Like my husband was a conscientious objector, and I was women weren't drafted then, but I certainly, I suspect I was a pacifist before he was, and certainly all the events around conscientious objector and the draft were important to us at the time during World War I. And I remember, I don't think I was involved, but I remember I was very startled when I got to Antioch, the town of Yellow Springs. I'd never seen this before. I went to the movies one time, and I noticed, very early on, a section in the back of the theater on one side that was roped off, and that was a section for black people. I never, we got rid of that. I don't remember when we got rid of it, but and later on, Hardy and Jean Trolander, particularly Jean, got the barbershop integrated down there, but that was after I'd gone. I don't remember. I mean, there were many national events. I mean, conscientious objectors sent to sent to jail, and many of our friends, were sent to jail. My husband expected to be sent to jail. By jail, I mean the federal reformatories at the time, and we were very concerned about the internment of the Japanese Americans in the Nisei at the time. And we belonged to many organizations, racial things too. We were War Resisters League, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was one of the original, involved with all the original founders of the National ACLU. CORE, Congress on Racial Equality. We gave money to the NAACP lawyers group. I can't remember its name now. We were involved and interested in all those kinds of things while we were right after we graduated from Antioch and lived in Yellow Springs. We were on a group of people that were dedicating in the community to helping community relations and race relations, and one of the things we were involved with was the African American Methodist Church. Doug was going to fix their plumbing there and help build a playground. But the interesting thing about that was there were a number of communists who were pacifists for a while, but when Russia got into the war, they dropped their pacifism, and so that particular group just dissolved.
So you helped found the Yellow Springs chapter in the late 40s. Can you talk a little bit about
Well, I don't know whether I helped found the Yellow Springs chapter in the late 40s. As I say, we had a committee, and I don't know, it may have been a faculty committee, because I was on the faculty in well, first I worked for the college in the files. I was in charge of their files. And then I was teacher of the younger group at their Antioch school, and as such I was a member of an instructor, considered an instructor on the faculty. But I really think we had a committee before. Well, when did we go to war? We didn't go to war till about 44 or something, and it may have not have been until then. But we were concerned about all the things that happened in relation to various civil liberties issues, speech and other things, and so we had this committee, which was not necessarily a chapter, made up of there were at least 5 of us on it. I was one of them. Genevieve Heatley, who was at that time administrative secretary, I think, to the president, either the president or vice president. John Sparks, who was in the economics department, and I don't remember who the 2 others were. And we met regularly to discuss things in the area and in Ohio, but also in general.
What kind of role did you play in that chapter?
Well, I don't think I was anything. I think I was nobody was the leader, sort of. We were all. I think we were all could be considered leader. We probably had a chair. I was not the chair, but we all were very acquainted with everything that was for the most part, that was going on or brought to the meeting, things that we might know or might be brought to our attention.
And how did your experiences with Yellow Springs then play into when you founded the Oberlin chapter later?
Well, my experience in Yellow Springs was so much better than when we moved to Oberlin in 1947. I'd been told that this community, I'd visited this community. I'd visited friends who'd graduated from Antioch that lived here. She taught at kindergarten, and he taught English at the college for a while. So we were acquainted with the community, but we didn't realize until we moved here or observed the fact that, at that time, the girls at college were all dressed up for dinner, and they said grace at meals, and the girls had to be in at 10 o'clock, and that was a very different experience than I had, and it just kind of shocked me that everybody was acceptant of that kind of stuff here. And my husband and I always had not the idea, but wherever we lived or wherever we moved, we became acquainted with it. We drove all over this town to look it over and see, and we were very startled to find that there was a pretty evident black area, well, we called Negro area then, and they didn't have good streets or sidewalks, and some of them were in run-down shacks, and the African Americans, as we call them now, that were professional, were pretty careful about how they spoke out about things because they didn't want to jeopardize the position they had. And I'm not even sure that they had any black professors at the college at that time. But and that, of course, startled both my husband and I, and in our individual ways, we tried to do things about it.
Do you remember if the
At that time, the town was a village, had 5-member village council, and it was usually local businessmen, like the president of the bank or the president of the Ben Franklin, and the business person at the college. So that sort of thing, and they were also. This was actually a very Republican community too. It had a landslide for Al Landon during the war instead of Franklin D. Roosevelt. There was a lot of prejudice against Franklin, and particularly against Eleanor in this community at that time, even among some college people. It was just kind of. Wow, what kind of a place did we move to that has this reputation?
But you found others to start a chapter.
Well, there were other, things changed in this town. When the population got big enough to change to a city and to a 7-member council, and Bill Long, who was a very important person in this community, moved here. He'd served in the war, and he became executive director or whatever of our co-op store. They did have a co-op here, a very small store. It had a small inventory of groceries, and it also had a dry cleaning business. And Bill expanded that to a great big bookstore and got most of the orders for college books in it. And at one point we had a big grocery store, and we had a very, very my husband served on that board for many years, but Bill Long was a leader in this community, and then at that time, many people, or several people, that they called the Young Turks at that time, young advanced people like Ken Roos, who had been a conscientious objector out in California and had refused to take the loyalty oath at the University of California, I think it was. And others moved here, and somehow or other we all got together in individual and group ways, and we were part of a group that really changed this town. Got on city council. I remember Doug and I talking about, well, you do local government things and I'll do school things. And that's how I started going to the local school board by a fluke when I first moved here in 1947, and I've gone every year. I've attended it every year on a regular basis since. My husband was on various committees that were the building committee, the human relations committee, I don't remember all the various committees he was on, and then eventually he ran for council and was on council for a while. And we were just part of a group that changed things in lots of ways. We were part of the group that developed the first fair housing ordinance here, and so on.
What was that fluke that got you to attend the school board meetings?
Well, my friend Natalie Feast was a school teacher here. She taught kindergarten. And in those days, school teachers didn't speak up or ask too many questions. But there was a school controversy going on in an election. And we had two newspapers in the town then, the Oberlin News Tribune and the Oberlin Times, I think it was. The Oberlin Times was a little bit more liberal than the Oberlin News Tribune, but they were both good newspapers. And there was a conflict about various things at school. Everybody was saying things about each other, pretty nasty. And Natalie said, was telling me about it. She said, why don't you go to school board and see if that's the way they act? Because nobody would care about me. I was new. Although they cared. As new people to this community, we were different in terms of excuse me, in terms of our architecture and our design, Johnson Ratner's design and building of houses here that were modern and so on. So I went and discovered that very few people, if any, went to school board meetings. This austere group was sitting behind a table with the superintendent of schools and the treasurer, and they didn't even have any chairs set up for anybody that might come in. But very soon, there were two newspaper reporters at the time. One was Bob Thomas, who was an African American, who later was on council and a whole bunch of other prestigious things, but he was a reporter for the Lorraine Journal, and another one named Ted Jones, who was also African American, who worked for the Chronicle Telegram. And then there was a young new reporter at the Oberlin News Tribune. And it was Bob Thomas and the reporter for the News Tribune and myself. And I don't remember exactly what we did, but we opened up those meetings, to allowing they're being accustomed to people coming, because the newspaper reporters never said anything, and speaking up and saying things and asking questions and asking for papers and so on. That was me.
So transparency, is something that you really are dedicated to.
Well, through various processes. That was not my main interest to begin with. Was the First Amendment and free speech and religion in the schools, and that was one of the things that we got rid of very early here in the early 1950s. They used to pass out Gideon Bibles here in the schools, and I know I was active in that because a friend of mine a couple of years ago was cleaning out his stuff. He'd been on city council and other things for a long time, and he ran across an article that said that Mrs. Douglas R. Johnson had done such and such with the Gideon Bibles. I could not have done it alone. We had a number of ministers in the community who were civil libertarians, and we also at one point early on had meetings of a mixture of people here, some of whom were ministers and some of whom were civil libertarians, to talk about issues like that. And very early on, we got Christmas celebrations toned down, shall we say, to begin with. And eventually we got them so that we didn't really have the traditional Christmas celebrations in that way. We might have a holiday program where lots of different holidays were mentioned or expressed, or and different foods, or that's cultural things and so on. So I think we were probably one of the communities that was early on in that because of that particular group of us that were willing to speak up about it.
Do any other, just sort of in general terms, significant successes or failures come to mind when you think back on the Oberlin chapter during the 1950s?
Well, no, I can't. The 1950s is too long ago for me right now. I think I probably spoke about them when I gave my first interview in 1995. I would have to, the place to find them might be in the minutes. I was the first secretary of the local chapter, and I'll have to laugh. My minutes were written by hand in ink, and they are in the library. When I gave them to the library, I always kept them in this nice little notebook on loose leaf paper. They took them out of the notebooks, and but they have them at the college archives. So anybody that wants to know what the ACLU did in Oberlin the first few years can look at that. I think I kept pretty good minutes.
So can you talk a little bit about how you first got involved and how the founding of ACLU of Ohio came about?
Well, Max Ratner was my husband's partner in architecture. We all had gone to Antioch, and we'd all been. Max was a conscientious objector who was put in Danbury Reformatory in Connecticut. My husband was one of his correspondents. You were only allowed to communicate with a certain number of approved people, and Ken Roos, who had a house next door that was designed by Ratner and Johnson, built by them, had been a conscientious objector and a civil libertarian. I mean, a whole group of us were that kind of people with that interest and that drive. And Max and Ken went to Cleveland to their chapter, what chapter they had, and you have Ken Roos's stories, I think, about what he and Max did with Oscar Steiner in Cleveland, and a story about what happened when I think I told in my original memoir. I love that. And we were all concerned about the same kind of issues. From the war, probably previous to the war for whatever reason, and what was going on in this community and the things we were connected to in this community. And Ken, I mean, we would always discuss these kinds of things, the bunch of us in various ways when we saw each other. And Wildowski, in his book about Oberlin and small town government, he kind of puts it as though we had meetings or what have you, or a social life, or we weren't Bill Long and Max Ratner and the Johnsons, and well, they all had wives. We weren't the kind of people that threw parties. We just happened to be involved in a lot of things that made us be together and discuss these kinds of things. And so, I mean, Max and or Ken would tell me certainly about what was going on in the Cleveland situation, and in New York we were very concerned about the Elizabeth Gurley, is that her name? The thing with the ACLU National Board and whether they should have no communists on. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was her name. After I say it once, the whole name comes to me. So Ken would come back, and so would Max, and talk about it. And when they, so we were just, kind of a source and a support to each other about all these sorts of things. And when we decided they decided we should have a local chapter. I agreed with them, and I met Ken down at the corner here, I think, one day. I was coming home from downtown or something, and he was walking to the college, and he said, we've decided who should be on the board. And he gave me the list. What do you think? Have you got any ideas? And I looked at the list, and I've told this story 16,000 times, and said, well, there aren't any women on it. And he said, well, how about you? And that's how I got to be on the first Civil Liberties Board in town. And I was a founder to the extent that, I mean, there were lots of us that were founders because we all were concerned about this sort of thing.
Do you remember any significant issues covered by that board?
I don't remember them off the top of it. I mean, there certainly was religion. Obviously, there was religion in the public schools because, as I say, very early on, we got the Gideons. We got the Bibles stopped. We stopped Bibles being distributed in the schools, and we eventually, by a slow process, we began discussions of, religious practices in the schools for Christmas and Easter holidays, that sort of thing. And I don't know what point, we got prayer taken out of the baccalaureate service. And, those were our kinds of issues. I was as secretary, I'm not remembering it now, I was in charge of membership. And in those days, I had a 3x5 cards with members' names on it, and a running record on the back of it, name and address and phone number. That's the back of it. I would have paid, 6, 10, 52 paid their dues or made a contribution or whatever they did. I tried, but some of that record I had to get from New York, and you didn't have copies and things sent to you. Marie Runyon was the membership chair for the state national organization. I used to talk to her on the telephone to get things corrected. I'd call her up and say, Marie, what do you have on so-and-so? And we'd, a lot different than it's done now, right?
Yeah, slightly.
And I was the one that got the telephone calls for a long time. I'd give all kinds of advice to people over the telephone. People would call. I went to the school and they wouldn't let me see my child's folder. I did this. I asked for so-and-so. And I knew the procedure. I mean, I checked it with our executive directors or our lawyers, whoever they were at the time. And so I'd tell the people how to do it. And I'd say, if it doesn't work, let me know and I'll go with you or whatever. And they were just all kinds. I mean, and you got telephone calls. I mean, it's interesting because so many of the things that we worked on then seem to be no longer a problem. I haven't had anybody ask me how to get a kid's folder at school for years and years. Yeah. And we had lots of that at one time. Or even some other public records. I wasn't such an expert in it as I am now, but and that's a story of its own. But I was more interested in all these other things, and particularly the First Amendment, religion in the schools, and prayer, and Pledge of Allegiance, and so on. I've had that fight several times in this community. I think I told the story once. Yeah, I did tell it in my first thing about the man who called me from Sandusky, wanted to see me. It turned out he'd been in prison. He couldn't talk to me over the phone. He wanted to see me. I was naive and innocent then. He'd been in jail for rape. And I forget what he wanted. He wanted help for his appeal or get his record expunged or something. I don't remember. After that, I always let somebody know when somebody was coming to my house, or I saw them on the porch, which is more open, and had my inside door locked and my key in my pocket. But no, I was known as Mrs. Civil Liberties then, as I said in the talk I gave about Harvey. All those years, I was known as Mrs. Civil Liberties because I was the one that gave out the advice. And more often than not, it wasn't civil liberties advice. It was, well, who you called this particular social agency, or have you need to call up the Equal Opportunity Group in Cleveland, or again, I'll get back to you with the telephone number if you don't get it. Things like that. And we were very much respected. That was and liked for that. It made a lot of difference, I think, to people.
Do you think that the public perception of the ACLU and the work the ACLU does has changed a lot or a little bit since then?
I don't know. I think it has. It's funny. It depends on what group you are. In 1997, there was a woman that moved to Elyria from Columbus who called the state office and complained about the county commissioners and the meetings that they held, the kind of meetings they held. And so I think Chris called Steve Baer, who was our chair then, and said, is there anybody out there who could look into this? And I was the one because I knew most about attending. At that time, I was always going to school board and seeing that things were in the minutes and seeing that they had proper minutes and being acquainted with the Sunshine Law. Chuck Mosier, who was our congressman, state legislator, and then Don Pease later, they were both advocates of the Sunshine Law and open meeting. And so they wrote about it in their columns and editorials, but I early on became very acquainted with that, and so I started attending the commissioners' meeting, and I always sit in the front row. It was a habit of mine because I was legally blind for a while before I could have a cataract removed from my good eye, and to be sure I heard well because they didn't always speak loud enough. And that was another thing I always were after legislators or boards for speaking up. And at that time we had a man, Michael Ross. He was a young black man who was a commissioner, which was good. And he was an attorney, but he turned out to be, I don't want to use that term. He turned out, anyway, he was tried and has been in jail for various crimes he committed, favors he got and gave, and so on. But at that time, they weren't going into executive session properly. They weren't obeying the rules of the open meeting law in lots of ways. But that was particularly one that's very specific. He'd just say, "Well, we're going into executive session for personnel," and I explained to them, "You can't go in. You have to say what the reason is under personnel." And I told him the law. So it was a kind of a joke after a while because every time he'd start to say he was going into executive session, my hand would go up in the audience. And he'd see my hand. He wouldn't even call me. He just knew what I was going to say, and he did it. And I also had talks. Am I getting digressed? Well, this has to do with the Civil Liberties Union. Talks with the county assistant prosecutor that attends all the commissioners' meeting as their advisor. And at that time, as soon as I started going to the commissioners' meeting and asking questions and I made write up little speeches sometimes about what the law said and why they should be doing it or something of that sort. I have some of them around. And people from the townships would come to me. A lot of them were various delegates or people from townships were coming to commissioners' meetings perhaps because they weren't satisfied with what was going on in the township. And they'd say, "We can't do this, we can't do that. They don't let us do that." And I explained to them that The law does not say they have to they have to let us talk. But I said, but they do have to give you records, and they do have to do certain things, and they have to do certain things right. And here's whatever specific thing these people, different people, would tell me, they'd say, come to our meetings. They begged me to come to their meetings. I said, I can't go to all these meetings. I go to 3 now. And I said, but here's what you do. And I gave them specific directions on how to handle it. And if it doesn't work, let me know, and then I'll come to your meeting with you. Mostly I didn't have to, but I did a second thing with that. I went to Jerry Ennis, who was the assistant prosecutor then, that covers the commissioners, and as part of his job with the prosecutor's office, he also covers, is the lawyer for library boards and townships. So I went to him and I said, look, you need to go out and speak to at all these meetings, or you need to write them a letter and tell them how to do things and tell them what to pay attention to, and so on. And he actually did take hold and be sure that they all were informed, as well as how I informed individuals that came to me for help. There have been occasions when we've had to write letters. Once we had to write a letter to the Lorain County Water is a special water business that supplied water to various county areas. And a man went to them and asked them for a copy of something or other. And he was asked why he wanted it. And you're not allowed to do that. You cannot do that. And so we wrote a letter saying that we'd heard that they were doing this, and Reed and I signed the letter. I think that was when Reed was chair recently. And some of the township trustees know me, and they were involved in this, and they called me, or they were on that board they called me, one of them did, and said, oh, Mrs. Johnson, we don't mean to do that. We'll take care of it right away. And I said, fine. I thought, but they had a lawyer. Their lawyer was, they were a firm, Baumgartner and somebody, I forget the whole name of the firm. One of the trustees, I think it was, told me that they were told not to speak to me because the ACLU had big monies and big pockets. Big pockets, that was the expression. And he might say something that would incriminate him, I guess. I thought that was hysterically funny, but I think that was one way we were respected. They thought we might be a little more aggressive than we necessarily were going to be in some respects. But it's very funny. I've had Elizabeth Rummix join me pretty soon after I started in some of this activity. She goes to all the meetings too. Doug and I went first. We're there first. We got a number of things changed there. They charged 50 cents a page for a copy of anything at that time. And that was one of the things I gave them a speech on and what the law said. And they passed a special resolution returning my money for what I'd paid for and changing to being the cheapest, 5 cents a page, the first 5 pages free or something like that. And the same thing happened when they African American groups like to say prayers and so on, and they came at one point, and I think they particularly wanted to say prayers for Michael Ross. That was before he'd been indicted, but there was some concern about him. They didn't say they wanted to say prayers for him, but I think that they wanted prayers said there, sort of. And Elizabeth didn't realize that we'd had a suit in Cleveland that sort of allowed the Cleveland Council to begin with prayer, as I recall. But so she got up and made a very strong statement about that they shouldn't do that. And when she sat down, I whispered to her, I said, well, that isn't exactly true, but I'm glad you said it. But I made a statement, read a statement of a general application of why they shouldn't be doing that, because there are different people of different religions and no faith, and we come to their meetings to see how our government operates, not to see how they say a prayer or hear a prayer. And they paid attention to us. They've paid attention to me every time. And although I have differed with many people, and different people have differed with me, veterans groups, I never stand for the Pledge of Allegiance there. I think I always sit. And only once has anybody raised a question with me about that, and that was a man who was I think he was on a labor council in the area, and he poked me, and he was sitting behind me, and he sort of poked me in the back and said, "You should stand up." It was during the 9/11 period, and I didn't, but I have always carried a little statement prepared. If anybody asked me that, I was always going to tell them that they really didn't have any right to ask me, but I would tell them. But I'm actually so respected over there. I am respected by people there. So even though I have a differing opinion in many cases, they listen and are sometimes effective. Did I say that Elizabeth and I had a couple of anonymous notes from employees thanking us for coming there and raising questions. And it kind of bothers me because I'm sort of treated as one of, Lori Kukowski, one of the commissioners, when I got up and said something, I forget what it was, and I don't think they agreed with me, she announced, "We love you, Shirley. And you love us," even though I was criticizing him about telling him something. And I said, "No, I don't love you. I don't love any of you." But I've gotten up at times and said, "You all treat me so nice. I'm sure you must be doing something behind the scenes that I would object to, but because you're all so nice to me all the time." And every once in a while I'll make that little statement. So, and it was very funny. Recently, a Tea Party man was coming to the meetings. He's running for council in Lorraine now, so he hasn't been the last several. And he's very friendly. He was a Democrat to begin with, he told me. Now he's become a Tea Party man. He doesn't like big government. He doesn't like all this money. He doesn't like all these taxes. And I've gotten up on many occasions, although I'm not supposed to take stands on things, but I've made statements to the effect that if you cut here and there, you are affecting juveniles and juvenile justice or something like that. Might be the nature of this little speech I ought to make. And a couple of times when we were all done, this man who annoyed me quite a bit at the time would say to me, "Well, we told him, didn't we?" And he was telling him one thing, and I was telling him another. And I don't know whether he understood that I was telling him something different, or that was really a very broad-minded and good thing that they listen to both of us. They do. They listen very well. It's turned into the politest and most accepting group and answering group of any that of the council in Oberlin, which was the leader for many years in that, being good about that, and school board, which has deteriorated quite a bit in the last, say, 8 years. So I would say that not only in me, in my person, do they respect, at least for me, and probably the Civil Liberties Union, because I often have said the organization that I represent is, or as the organization that I represent would say, although, and the local board, to the extent that we have one anymore, respects. I'm sort of their appointee in that area, although they couldn't stop me anyway. If I didn't speak for the civil, as a civil libertarian, I'd be speaking as just me, I guess.
How do you spell Elizabeth's last name?
Rumics, Rumics.
You had mentioned Harvey a few minutes ago, Harvey Gittler, who just recently passed. Could you talk a little bit about him and your relationship?
Well, as I said in the talk I gave at Civil Liberties Board meeting last Saturday, Harvey moved here about 1968, and I met him in the late 60s through a fellow civil libertarian, Estelle Berman, who knew his wife first. And she mentioned, well, we ought to get Harvey. She knew I was was doing, was behind the scenes, otherwise doing too much more of the civil liberties work than anybody else, and would have liked a little help. And it's been a constant battle in this community, not a battle, but to find people who would really, everybody's so involved in a lot of things, somebody who would really be chair. And I usually ran around asking people, will you be chair, will you run for chair? And then on a couple of occasions I got co-chairs because nobody wanted to be totally responsible. So I was sort of the advancer or leader behind the scenes to that extent. And so we asked him to run for the board, and he got elected, and Harvey goes into gear very fast, and as I said, he's an unusual man. He's unique in many ways. He's a leader, and he can be a very annoying person sometimes to people because he's very sure when he's correct that he's correct, but he also has had a very good sense of humor, was very witty and very clever in the speeches and things he made at various times at various places. And our lives, as I said, became entwined from the very beginning in various ways. I don't remember, I'd have to look at the obit, how soon after that his wife died, his first wife, Adele. Harvey, before I say anything about that, Harvey, we were on the board together, we consulted each other. Whenever anybody called him about school things, he'd discuss those things with me and how to handle them and so on. And we did have the famous strip search case in Elyria. I don't remember the year now. It probably is in this speech that I wrote one time. See if I can find it quickly. Well, I guess I better not take the time to look right now. Oh, here it is. 1987. It was the Elyria school strip search case. And I talked about other things we did then. Apparently, North Ridgeville City Council's speech policy, some other school board and local government matters. Well, we have exercised quiet influence in all kinds of privacy, free speech, religious freedom, demonstrations, open records, open government, due process, minority, and so on matters. And have made lots of educational efforts and given help to people on how to help themselves. And so that's really kind of all there. When Harvey was on, and his wife were on a trip to Japan, and she got terrible headache, and they had to come home, and they discovered after she got home she had a brain tumor that they couldn't do anything about. And so a number of us, I was not the only one, a number of friends helped and would go and sit with Adele and see that she got her medications and stuff like that, and supported Harvey through all that. And I know I was on the phone at least once a day and maybe several times after she died with him, as were other people that helped him. I mean, they had lots of friends. They were quite a couple in the community in many respects. They did different things. I think he gave her a llama for a birthday present or an anniversary present one time, and they had some llamas in their big yard, and of course, as I said, they took in. They had two children, natural children, and then they adopted the twins when they were 13, Jewish twins that they heard about over WCLV that needed parents because their parents had died and they had nobody in family to take care of them, and they took them in and adopted them and saw them on their merry way in many ways. And then they had children, high school students from international, whatever the organization is that brings students in, that lived with them, and college students that lived with them or visited with them, that sort of became part of their families. In actuality, the whole celebration of Harvey's life was taken up by wonderful speeches by each one, the people they'd taken in, their own children, the people they'd taken in, their wives and spouses, their spouses and their grandchildren, and some local African American here that was a classmate of my son's and that I liked a lot, and his mother was a friend of mine. They all told stories about how Harvey taught them how to mow the lawn, and how you start here and you go this direction and you come around this way and you meet it here, and you had to do it his way, take out the trash, and so forth and so on. And they all appreciated it throughout the rest of their life. Apparently teach their kids to do it that way too. I don't know, but he was confirmed. He was a very strong civil libertarian, and he devoted a lot of his life in different ways than mine, because he easily became a leader, president, and so on. I did not do that. For a long time, I was very reluctant to make speeches or to talk in public, but I forget when I got over it, but I got over it now. I don't seem to have any trouble even speaking extemporaneously and too much. But anyway.
Are there any other significant ACLU leaders that you worked with that come to mind?
Oh, well, there are lots of them. They're all in the local community, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, Ken Roos was, particularly. As long as he was here. He left after a while. He was my next-door neighbor, and before we built this house, he had his house there, when we were around the corner. We saw each other. Our families saw each other frequently, not for partying, but for co-op business, city business, school business, civil liberties business. Those were just things that are all our interests. You make me feel bad that I can't think of a bunch of people now. Where would I'm sure I...
Yeah, put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, extemporaneous, that's too hard to remember everybody. I don't want to leave people out. Molly and Dave Anderson. Dave Anderson they were Episcopalians, and he became an Episcopalian priest or minister, whatever they called him. And he was very active in working with the schools, the religious celebrations in the schools, and in the fair housing. They were very active in all those kinds of things. Sam Goldberg, who was very active, he was chairman for a while. Oh, Lord, I ran across a list of chairmen recently and people. Joe King, who was the minister of the First Church at the time we came here, and was a very well-liked and very strong and powerful speaker at the church, was one of our first Civil Liberties Board members. George Simpson, who was our first chair and was in the sociology department. His wife was involved in League of Women Voters, as was I. And George was a very inspiring leader. We had a conference earlier in the 50s, Conference on Intellectual Freedom. George was... I discovered a program when I was cleaning out some things, and I gave a copy of it, I think, to Roland for the archives. And George and I were associated for a long time in civil liberties matters, and I was with his wife, Eleanor. They were marvelous people. And George was one of the first people that did a lot about racial integration and that sort of thing, too, in his early years. I know a lot of people will come to mind after you leave, and I'll feel very bad because I neglected them, because there were a lot. And there were people. Of course, Don Pease was a legislator. Don and Jean Pease were friends of ours, personal friends of ours, all through those years. But Don had to be careful about some of the things he did and some of the things he voted for because of his territory and some of this part of the country. I mean, for example, in his votes on abortion issues, because of the strong Catholic population up in Lorraine and so on. I used to argue with him like mad and put pressure on him. He'd say he had to handle it that way because of if he wanted to be reelected. But both he and Chuck Mosier. Chuck Mosier was a Republican. Don was a Democrat. And I remember, I mean, in the early days of the Civil Liberties Union here, we would write telegrams, nightgrams. That's not what they were called. I mean, you communicated differently in those days. And I remember sitting on the telephone, calling various people and reading this telegram I was sending to Chuck Mosier, say, put your name on it, and I'd get a whole bunch of names and send it off. And could we put pressure on various legislators or on our legislators at the time when various things came up? And if you're talking about the local people that influenced me, well,
Cleveland, Cleveland too, Oberlin and Cleveland.
Ralph Rudd because he was a conscientious objector too, and a very, very nice, straightforward, decent person, and understood his civil liberties too. He was on the state board from Cleveland for a while. He may have been chair at one point. I think he was early on. I feel bad. If I could see a list of people, I'd think of it, but.
No, you've given plenty of names. This is wonderful.
Well, yeah, but there were lots more.
Oh, well.
We had a very good community and circle of people who cared about all these civil liberties issues at that time. That's one of the things that's so sad. That nowadays, nobody seems to speak up. Nobody seems to speak out. That's what Louise Melling said in her speech here last Wednesday. And it's very tough to find people that will write a letter or even think of doing it. They communicate with each other on their emails and they think they've done something. It bothers me more than I can say in a straight. I get angry about it sometimes. I can't use the expression. I shouldn't use the expression for eternity on this tape. How that makes me feel.
Well, in addition to transparency and religion in schools, are there any other civil liberties issues that you feel especially strong about?
Well, I don't feel. I feel strong about the wrong interpretation of the Second Amendment, and I can't do anything about that right now. I mean, I don't think that's what it means, that everybody should have a gun, a concealed weapon. Well, I think due process was a very strong interest of mine, and all kinds of equalities, not just racial equality, religious equality or non-religious equality, gay. Oh, that's one of the things. It's so sad in some ways. Some time ago, I can't remember how many years ago, the students of the high school created a study group. I can't remember the exact title. It was a gay-straight, was probably what it was called, study group. I could look up the dates because I know who the superintendent or principal was then. And he wouldn't let them have it. His name was James Gray. And I heard about it. One of my friends that taught out at the vocational school, I was a teacher of learning disabilities, and ADHD my last 5 years of teaching from age 70 to 75, and she taught that sort of thing out of the vocational school. She called it to my attention. And so I stood up at the school board meeting and told them that they couldn't do that they had to allow it, and spoke up for that. And then these other people came too, and then they spoke up. Often I'll be the first, or else I'll do the summary. But I mean, we didn't plan it, but it just happens that way. And Chris told me at that time that I was the hero of the gay group in Cleveland. And I said, well, that's so sad to think that just anybody saying something that minor, to be obvious, would make you a hero for a group, for people. And I suppose that was true in those days. But I can't say I could say the First Amendment and freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and all the things that go along with it. And I really put open meetings and open records in that same category, I suppose. And due process, particularly, also, is that the 14th Amendment? Don't make me have to figure out what should be. But I can't say that there isn't any civil liberties issue that I wouldn't speak up for or haven't probably spoken up for through the ages.
Well, what do you feel, this is going to put you in the hot seat again, what do you feel is your greatest contribution to the ACLU and to civil liberties in Ohio?
Well, I suppose the fact that I have been, I can't think of the right word, I was going to say so the spokesman for so long, I wasn't the only one, but I was a continuing one, and a continuing pressure for their being, and for the organization continuing and being successful in the ways that it was, and an advisor in so many ways to so many people, and continuing to be. I'm known for that. I'm consulted for that, and I'm respected for that. And I can't think of anything to be more thankful for, sort of, except for my teaching career. And because I had a very good reputation in that too. I always laugh about these memorial celebrations. Neither Doug nor I have planned for anybody to do that. I always said that, I received enough awards. I received several awards from the teaching profession, and from my fellow teachers, and I've received one from Antioch Alumni Association, and I've received one from the ACLU, and I've received more recently a local one for the League of Women Voters First Impact Awards. I wasn't the only one, but I was one that did. And I just do what I think is important to do. I don't do it for recognition. And I think it's kind of sad that a person has to be recognized for doing what I think everybody should do, kind of. Everybody should speak up and speak out is my philosophy. And they should be informed, but they should do it in terms of all the things all the kinds of things that happen. So.
That's wonderful. No. Well, do you have any other concluding thoughts or remarks you'd like to share about your experience with the American Civil Liberties Union?
Well, yes, I haven't spoken about the state board, and I want to say that the state board through the years, a number of people have had a very strong influence on me, because the state board were always people there were professors of constitutional law or attorneys and so on, and I always felt that they should have lowly people like me, teachers, and others across, and they did have a few of us, and I was one of them. But I learned so much from all those people. I learned so much from Benson Woolman and his thinking in the areas of civil liberties. think about the only thing I disagreed with him about was the issue of campaign contributions. And I would have loved to have had him live long enough to see what he thought about the last Supreme Court decision on that. I could go along with it first, but as it developed, I think it was. I don't agree. There were other attorneys and people. Now that I might be able to supply some information on, but at various times, David Goldberger was, of course, because he was so brave in many respects. He wouldn't say so. To have taken on that Skokie case was a very hard thing to do, and it's even to this day, some people remember it with anger. But there were. I want to locally. I should say. I mean, Bill Long was more of a practical civil libertarian. I'm talking about this community now. Brownson Clark, who was a fellow conscientious objector, and he went to jail for a while too. And then he drove an ambulance in China, and he worked for the Quaker. He was a Quaker and worked for the American Service Quaker Committee. He was a fellow Antiochian, and we all had none of us had more. We all had influence on each other and argued out these things and talked about them. That was sort of like our Antioch heritage. I mean, I just think it's as I said, I've already said, it's the business of people to speak up and to be informed and take part. And I know there are a lot of other people on the state level that influenced me. There were people on the national level that influenced me I met them when I went to what'd you call those conferences? The biennial. The biennial. But I thought Strassen was very good. There were some people from other states whose names I can't remember anymore. There was one that I voted for when I was on the national board. There were people I voted for. Vance Fitzgerald, back in the early days of the ACLU, he was president from 61 to 65, and then from 68 to 70, and he was very good. Bernie Dushman, who was president when I was vice president, or chair when I was vice chair, I don't know what we called each other. Mark Williams Young I liked him very much. He was a young man. Oh, Nicky Schwartz. Nobody mentions Nicky Schwartz, and I forgot to mention him as a friend of somebody that Harvey admired. Nicky Schwartz was very, very good when he was on the board. You learned from him. He's a lawyer in Cleveland. Harvey consulted him when I forget who he had difficulties with when he retired the corporation. And Doug and I consulted Nicky when we thought Doug might be a victim of age discrimination at the end of his career. And I know there were other delegates who influenced me. You ought to be interviewing really Mark Levy, and I don't know whether you're doing people in Columbus.
Oh yeah, I've been down to Columbus.
Have you? Well, Mark Levy took over after Benson Woolman left in '86, and he knows a lot about the union in its office when it was down there, because he worked under Benson.
Thank you so much, Shirley. It really has been a pleasure to speak with you. You certainly are a wealth of information for us, and it's really been an honor to share your memories.